Thank you very much, Crispin. I want to appreciate that you have given me a moment to go ahead and speak to us. Really, this is a very important session as far as social protection is concerned. And definitely having realized that there's a growing need for, eradication of poverty, increase to access to basic services, and improved household is important that we get really to understand what is happening around, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what are the gaps that exist. So we are going straight to look at the presenters that we have. Our first presenter in this case is coming through from Amrik, and so you'll allow me therefore to bring Amrik to us to speak to us on what is happening around the conversation on social protection. If I may just bring in and speak a little about Amrik, just to introduce her. Dr. Amrik Heya is a senior researcher and advisor at FSD Kenya. And while I was, looking through, she says she's a researcher and policy analyst specializing in inclusive finance and inclusive growth, a very strong one. And her work is really focused on identifying the policy levers to support resilience and recovery in the face of macro level shocks, such as the COVID-19. And looking at this, of course, the focus areas being policy opportunities for strengthening demand through progressive social security framework, and of course, easing barriers to resilience growth for small firms. And definitely this is a very strong point as far as our first presenter is concerned. And while she's coming through, I know her deck is being raised. And so I want to call upon our first presenter, Dr. Amrik, to speak to us. Dr. over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fanes. I'm very, very honored to be here today. So thank you very much for inviting me. And it's quite an important moment for us, actually, because we recently launched, in fact, I wish I had a copy of it to hand, but we just launched a paper on social protection and growth about a week ago. So it's very timely for us. Maybe what I'll do is I'll also perhaps indicate when we move the slides. We could actually just go back to the title slide for a second. Just as I introduce it, sorry. Yeah, maybe slide number 2 there. We just launched a paper last week, and in fact in Kenya, here in Kenya, we had a big convening, a big global conference on social protection hosted by the State Department Social Protection Secretariat. And so it's very front of mind here in Kenya at the moment. And we launched the paper sort of in conjunction with that conference, and it was really sort of trying to put front and center of the debate that social protection is a critical pillar of growth, because much of the discussion is around sort of the importance of social protection in supporting the vulnerable or alleviating the impact of trickle-down growth and so forth. And we're trying to argue against that in a way, that sort of charity model of social protection, and say that particularly for growth and more so even for women's participation in growth, it's really critical for us to be viewing social protection in a more ambitious light. So I'll go into that argument in a minute. I also wanted to start by saying one thing that struck me when I was attending the conference, especially we had a session on financing, for example, where FSD was presenting how do you finance social protection. And all the participants in the room, the speakers who were women, the first thing they said, they introduced themselves and they said, yes, and I am a mother. And I have, they talked a bit about their family and their children. I'd never sort of heard that before. And I thought that was really quite fascinating, because there seemed to be already immediately in their minds this sort of connection between social protection and motherhood. And these were bankers, these were people who were, top kind of economistic type people. And they just introduced themselves first and foremost as mothers. And it was an unusual experience for me to see that. So I will today introduce myself as a mother as well. My daughter just turned 18 2 days ago. I'm going to be talking a little bit about child benefit, for example, but she would no longer be eligible for that. In fact, this morning we went to get her ID, her national ID, so that was quite exciting. So yeah, with that introduction, I will launch straight in. So perhaps we could then have my first slide. The slides
it's coming up in a minute.
Okay. I'm also very happy to share my slides, Crispin, if that's easier, because I've got them on my screen. Is it easier if I just share mine?
Yep.
It seems to have given me permission to share if you'd like me to.
Okay. Just go ahead.
Just let me know if you can see that.
Yes, we can see it. Dr. You can proceed.
Thank you. Slideshow mode, there we go. Great. Okay, so I wanted to start off with a bit of context here. These slides, which were done by somebody who does this economic modeling globally, actually, but with a focus on South-South economies in this particular instance, quite struck me recently. You know, what I realized that particularly in the case of Africa, which is that bright green bar, the line, sorry, you know, we're faced with this situation where we're still undergoing our demographic transition. Many other countries are sort of further along that journey. So whatever growth we manage to achieve over the next 20, 30 years is not necessarily going to result in growth in income per capita. And I think we have to recognize that, you know, much as we're supporting growth, we are even seeing our economies growing quite fast. This may not translate at the household level in better incomes, better sort of quality of life and so forth. So that's a piece of context I wanted us to recognize. Let's see if I go down here. There we go. Let me just start with that one. In Kenya in particular, we've actually recently seen a very steep decline, in fact, in two key indicators of well-being: median personal monthly income and food security. This is actually from FinAccess data, not from our National Bureau of Statistics.
Doctor, you're muted. Kindly unmute.
Okay. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So in Kenya, we've also been facing this sort of decline in our well-being. And this is since 2016. This is pre-COVID. And it's partly due to, you know, this particular context of ours and some of the sort of economic policies that have been put in place. But it is also a sign of our increasing exposure to global shocks. I'm talking COVID, I'm talking climate change, you know, war in Ukraine, global market pressures and so forth. So ours is an economy that's going to be increasingly exposed to shocks. And this is true of many other economies in the region as well. So again, we have to recognize that as a piece of context. I work on financial inclusion, and it's quite interesting that we've seen a big rise in digital financial inclusion during the same period that we've seen this sort of decline in well-being. And that kind of illustrates the point that, you know, financial inclusion alone cannot really help us to sort of reverse those trends and support a more inclusive trajectory for growth. Yeah, we need to create other mechanisms, other policy tools, and that's where the need for floors as well as ladders comes in, and that's of course an argument for social protection. Now going to our paper, what we identified, this was done together with Development Pathways, who of course is a major player in this area, many of you will know them. We looked at 11 pathways through which social protection can potentially impact on growth, many of which have quite strong implications for women, and I'll go into that in just a second. But one thing I wanted to mention here, and please do feel free to check out the paper, it's on our website. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. Design really matters here, and that's coming back to this point about universal long-term rights-based programs being critical if we want to achieve growth, and not just this sort of charity model or sort of targeted model under which social protection's often been delivered. Now, turning to what what are the implications of this sort of link between social protection and growth, particularly for women? Well, again, if we look at women's labour, we can sort of broadly conceive of it as being divided between two spheres of the economy currently, certainly here in Kenya. We have the care economy, which is essentially centred around households where women play a very, very important role, unpaid normally, and they often assume the burden of household responsibilities, household care, and they also bear the brunt of shocks, which often get devolved from players higher up in the economy right down to the household layer. So you can imagine households are there sort of carrying these big shocks, COVID, Ukraine war, you know, inflation, all these kinds of big shocks, climate that we are exposed to. Where the further down you get in the economy, the more people seem to be bearing the brunt because nobody's taking that pressure off. The state is not necessarily playing its role in alleviating those pressures at the lower end of the economy. And that burden often falls on women. Similarly, women play a very important role in the informal economy. We can see this particularly in their role in small businesses, you know, where they actually dominate. There's more women in Kenya who earn an income through business than there are men. So in the context of these two dual roles, social security is really important. I'm going to illustrate a point here for MSEs. During COVID, we actually did a COVID tracker under the FinAccess survey here in Kenya. And we found, you can see this sort of green graph here at the top right-hand side of the screen, where we see that the income of businesses really revenue crashed, during COVID for many businesses across the country. But meanwhile, FSD was implementing a program in Marsabit, which was leveraging on the Hunger Safety Net program, which is a cash transfer that's delivered across many ASAL countries, particularly in northern Kenya. And we found that women in those communities, which were broadly where most of the households were receiving this HSMP cash transfer, did not see their businesses crash in the same way. In fact, even those who were just receiving the cash transfer actually saw even some growth during that same period where businesses across the rest of the country were falling. People in our program where they were receiving not just a cash transfer, but also all these other sort of inputs into financial capabilities, really saw their incomes grow quite substantially during that period. So that's quite instructive here. And one of the reasons for that is because the fact that a broad base of households received a cash transfer during that period meant that they could maintain consumption, they could maintain demand. And that in turn meant that businesses could maintain their revenue. Now, if you have a targeted cash transfer, you won't get that demand side floor across the economy that supports businesses to maintain stability and resilience during periods of large scale shock. So that's one thing I wanted to illustrate, particularly for MSEs. Of course, we also have to bear in mind for MSE householders themselves, social protection is potentially quite important. If your child suddenly gets ill and you're a business owner, you don't want to have to liquidate your stock to send your child to hospital. So even for MSE owners themselves, social protection is critical. And in fact, we've seen that with the universal income experiment, actually, which is also going on, universal basic income experiment in Kenya, where actually the impact on business revenues just in the first 2 years of that program has been quite substantial. I also wanted to mention globally that social security, again, these universal social security models have quite high impacts on women's employment relative to men's. So again, we're seeing a particularly strong impact on women and women in the context of labor markets from universal social security programs in countries across the world. Women here, the dark blue line, a bar rather, you can see that's taller in most cases than the orange. A couple of exceptions here as well. But in many countries, the impacts are stronger for women than they are for men. And then I also wanted to mention this point about inequality. So one of the major impacts of social security programs, and again, we're talking particularly of universal life cycle social security systems here, is on inequality, which we can measure looking at the Gini coefficient. And as we know, societies with a lot of inequality tend to get sort of low or more unsustainable, unstable forms of growth once inequality passes a certain point, sort of if the Gini coefficient goes above 0.39 or something, it does have a negative impact on growth. And you know, high Gini coefficient, even if we don't have gender disaggregated data here, often has particular impacts for inequalities that impact women, particularly through these economic kind of intersectionalities. So that's another way in which universal social security programs can have strong impacts on women. It's reducing levels of certainly economic and social inequality. And then lastly, going back to the point about the care economy, you know, we can also sort of see a very clear benefit. This is a modeling actually that we've done in the paper on what would a universal child benefit mean for households in Kenya? What sort of impacts would it have? So this is a simulated impact on consumption and expenditure if we were to roll out a child benefit here in Kenya. And we can see that for the lowest income households in this, you know, in this context, you would see a very high impact on both consumption and expenditure. That goes down as you get to the highest income households, but in lower income wealth deciles, it's high, it's quite high. And as we know, you know, children who have better nutrition, for example, often have better health outcomes and certainly better educational outcomes. So again, this speaks to the role of women as caregivers and the importance of that for creating strong human capital as countries in continents like Africa enter the middle of the century and really want to take advantage of our demographic dividend and not be subject to a demographic curse. This role of women as caregivers, this sort of household economy layer, is critical for building our human capital, and social security is really important in that context. Just finishing. This is my second last slide. I may not actually go through the last slide, in fact, but let me just go through, just mention this one very quickly, just to say that this is what a universal child benefit in Kenya could look like. And I just wanted to point out here that the graph on the right again, to show that actually it wouldn't be a huge percentage of GDP that it would take to deliver such a program. And the critical thing, again, that I want to argue is that it is very important that these social security programs be universal if we want to achieve the impacts that we're looking for women and for growth. And I think I'll end there because this slide gets a little bit complicated, but I'm happy to talk through it at another point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Daktari, for bringing us to speed with inclusive social protection and very intuitive discussion. And I saw this really coming Marsabit. And you're saying they did not feel this just as much as we felt in other regions. Their purchasing power was not really hampered, and therefore, you know, their economic power remained almost stable. So really, that is an insight to that discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Amrik.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Emily Romano. Emily Romano, as we can see, I want to really appreciate you for joining us today, a Senior Policy Manager at JPAL Global. Emily manages the social protection sector, and while she does her role on policy and communication team, she has written quite a lot on policy publications, cultivates new research partnerships, and of course conducts policy outreach for evidence dissemination. Very great lady there. Emily holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton University with a concentration of economics and public policy, and a bachelor's of arts in mathematical economics, analysis, and of course policy studies from Rice University. Emily, we are happy to have you today, even as we welcome you to speak to us. Now over to you, Romano.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here, and I was excited to receive the invitation to speak today. And I can already tell from the first presentation that I'm going to learn a lot from everyone here in this working group. But so I am here to present today on what we're calling an evidence review that we are currently almost ready to publish on the social protection sector at JPAL. It will actually be online on Monday, so I'll share it with Sarah so that she can share it with the rest of the group next week. But just to maybe start with a little bit of background information on social protection at JPAL. The Social Protection Initiative is a research initiative that we launched last year at JPAL that funds randomized evaluations of social protection programs in low and middle income countries and supports policy engagement to share insights from completed research. It's a joint project between JPAL and Evidence for Policy Design at the Kennedy School. And SPE, as we call ourselves, has three main activities. First is producing an evidence review, which I'll talk about today, which synthesizes existing research and identifies important evidence gaps. Second is rigorously evaluating policies and programs to improve social safety nets. And third is supporting policymakers and using research results to inform investments in social protection. And today we'll be talking about the evidence review. Would you like me to share my slides? I'm happy to do that.
Yes, Emily, please go on. Looks like we have a technical hitch.
Sure.
Like a co-host.
Yes. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So this slide just gives a bit of background on the evidence review and the main purposes for drafting it. But there are kind of many themes addressed in the evidence review, one of which is gender and social protection. And so given the focus of this community of practice group, I just wanted to spend a bit of time talking about some high-level evidence on gender and social protection that we summarize in the evidence review. And then also highlight some important questions for future research. So this is a topic area that we could talk about for hours, but I only have probably now about 7 minutes, 6 minutes. So I just picked a couple of areas of research discussed in the evidence review to highlight now. Kind of questions around design of social assistance and their impacts. So first, an important question for policy is whether it really matters who receives assistance. And there are many reasons to think that who is the recipient of social assistance matters. If money is spent differently in the household, depending on who receives it, then who is the recipient matters for policy. However, the empirical evidence on the degree to which this matters in a real world policy context is about mixed. Excuse me?
Purity, kindly mute yourself. Thank you.
So there are a number of studies that randomize whether transfers are given to men or women in low and middle income countries, and some find little effects overall. Just as one example, a study of Give Directly's unconditional cash transfer program in Kenya that randomized the recipient to be men or women found few differences on average. That said, the researchers did find that giving transfers to women led to higher reported psychological well-being and greater scores on an index of female empowerment measures, though they found no differences on some other dimensions studied, like food security or health. And the researchers also found that the size of the UCTs affected women's empowerment. Larger monthly transfers led to more empowerment than smaller monthly transfers. But on the other hand, varying the timing of the transfers, so giving them in a lump sum at once or spreading them out over a series of months, didn't have an impact on women's empowerment. Of note, a number of recent studies have shown how targeting social assistance directly to women can affect women's empowerment and choices. Recent evidence from India showed how within a government public works program, women who were set up to receive direct deposits of their transfers into their own accounts rather than their husbands, as well as some training on the account use, worked more in both the public sector program as well as in private sector jobs. So another fairly broad question is, what are the impacts of social assistance programs on women? And many evaluated social assistance programs have been shown to have particular benefits for women. This includes different sorts of cash transfers. Cash Plus and graduation programs have increased women's empowerment in multiple settings, as well as public works programs have been shown to increase female labor force participation in Sierra Leone and India. One less well-studied issue worth noting is the impact of CCTs on women's domestic workloads. The burden of fulfilling conditions may disproportionately fall on women, which would place additional workload and stress on them. Something else worth noting is that while women can receive many benefits of these programs, there is a fear that those who are less empowered and potentially those with a lot to gain could be those that are excluded from the system. And so extra assistance and outreach might be needed for these groups. As one example, a study in India showed that women with lower levels of autonomy were more likely to complete an application for a widow's pension program when they received application assistance and accompaniment to enrollment facilities. And a third topic we discuss in the evidence review, which is of course extremely important, is the interaction between social protection and gender-based violence. There are a few ways that we think social assistance could affect GBV. By ensuring financial security to households, social assistance may reduce poverty-related stress in the household and thereby decrease GBV. This effect could be reinforced if lower levels of stress reduce the adoption of coping mechanisms that are associated with GBV. Social assistance transfers may increase women's bargaining power within the household, which could discourage men from engaging in intimate partner violence. On the other hand, if household members disagree around the optimal allocation of transfers, or if spouses feel threatened by their wives' higher levels of economic empowerment, one worries that violence could increase. And so far, the evidence on social assistance and GBV has been somewhat mixed. Some studies that look at a variety of assistance types across different countries have shown that these programs decrease or attenuate GBV. Others find no impact, and in a few studies show that social assistance increased GBV for all or specific groups of women. So given these mixed results, understanding the heterogeneity in these effects and how to effectively design GBV programs to reduce GBV is a really critical area for future research. And a number of studies have begun to explore which dimensions of program design may be important to ensuring that these programs can work to reduce GBV. Given limited time, I want to kind of move on to my final slide, but a couple of questions that research is looking at is how the mode of the transfer might impact GBV differentially. Does coupling transfers with increased community level interactions help reduce gender-based violence? Does the size of the transfer matter? And going back to our earlier conversation, does who received the program matter for gender-based violence? And so I just wanted to conclude in my last minute around sharing some future research areas that may be of interest to this group. As I alluded to on my previous slide, there are many, many open questions related to gender and social protection. And so this is just a selection of questions that I thought might be of interest to this group. So of course, very broadly speaking, how can we best understand which types of programs are most effective in improving women's outcomes? Second, incomplete take-up of social programs is an important issue that we see in social assistance programs really across the world. So one question may be, how do gender and social norms affect the uptake of social protection for women and girls across the life cycle? Third, a big challenge that governments face when implementing social protection is the large informal population. If governments don't have access to information on people's incomes because they work informally, it may be challenging to identify who should receive social assistance programs. And so a question may be whether there are important differences between male and female informal workers and their access to social assistance. Fourth, women have particular nutritional and health needs at different stages of their lives. And so how can social assistance programs address the specific nutritional needs of adolescent girls and pregnant and breastfeeding women? As I mentioned on the previous slide, an understudied aspect of CCTs is the burden of fulfilling conditions. And so this question relates to that. And then the last question I have here relates to the, in part to some of the topics discussed in the first presentation around the care economy. So how does social protection interact with women's participation in the care economy? How might different types of social protection programs support the social care workforce, which is predominantly made up by women, and how do care and domestic responsibilities affect women's participation in social programs. So that was it for my presentation. And again, really happy to be here. And if you have if there are any questions in the chat, I'll take a look and respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Very insightful message. You've been talking about the impact of social assistance programs on how, of course, this is receiving women's outputs and outcomes, and really very informative. You have talked about GBV and social protection. How does this affect, across, various stages, and how effectively the design programs can really reduce the GBV as an important area for future research. Thank you very much. And I could see quite a lot on the chat box. Members are putting there some questions. I want to believe that we can address them. For instance, Moses says, what would we do differently in social protection programming to reduce impacts of GBV? That's a question to Emily, and of course we have others. So Emily probably could be looking at that as we move on to the next presenter. I really want to now to bring in Rose Mwangangi. Rose Mwangangi is from the State Department for Social Protection, and I would request that she takes the floor. Rose, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm present. Good afternoon, everyone from Kenya. And as you have heard, my name is Rose Mwangangi. I hope I'm audible. And I'm here to present on behalf of Lisel Mogaka, who is the Director for Social Development. And my presentation is already there. And before I start, the ministry that we are in, the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, is the home of the Directorate of Social Protection that looks into issues that has a Secretariat of Social Protection. And from there, we have programs that are aligned to what that Secretariat does. We have several departments in that ministry. So I'm presenting from the Directorate of Social Development and Social Protection. So there we are. The directorate that I'm directly presenting is the Directorate of Social Development that has got this, the mandate as per the Executive Order #1 of 2023. And it's outlined there. We have the Senior Citizen Policy, Vocational Training and Rehabilitation of Persons with Disabilities, National Volunteerism Policy, Policy and Programs for Persons with Disability, Policy and Programs for Older Persons, Community Development Policy, Community Mobilization, Registration of Several Groups, Protection and Advocacy of Needs of Persons with Disabilities, Family Protection Policy, and Support for Matrimonial and Succession Laws and Policies. And under that directorate, we have a vision to empower individuals, families, communities for sustainable socioeconomic development. And under the directorate, again, we have the directorate has various regulations, bills, and policies, which are at different levels of development, as outlined in our next slide. Because I was basically, we are looking at the policy, the updates regarding the current departmental policy direction. So the program under the directorate, we have four programs that you can see. One is community capacity support. Another one is disability program and rehabilitation services, family promotion and social welfare, dealing with family matters and older persons. And then we have the program continuation and support services. Next. So these are the policies and legislative frameworks under the department. So we have a new act called the Community Group Registration Act. And in this, we have really quite many women in this who register for socioeconomic activities. And with this act, we are now developing regulations to implement the act. And then our next step in this act that really supports women is a resource mobilization for finalization of the regulation and guidelines. Next. Then we have the Persons with Disability Bill 2023, which has been submitted to Parliament for debate and for also consultation between the Cabinet Secretary and the Parliament. So with this, our next step is consultation forums with the stakeholders to incorporate views and inputs. Next. So we also have the Older Persons Bill, as I've mentioned, that is under the Family Promotion and Welfare Division. The Directorate is currently drafting a comprehensive Older Persons Bill. And there is also a geriatric bill in Parliament tabled by one of our members of Parliament. And the ministry has already given its submission to address gaps within various legislations. So our next step for this bill is resource mobilization to support public participation and input on the ministry's draft Older Persons Bill and sensitization on the Parliamentary Committee on Social Protection. Next, we also have the National Volunteerism Policy of 2016, and the policy is being implemented, but it is due for review. And then our next step for the National Volunteerism Policy is resource mobilization to support review of this policy. Next, we have the draft Community Development Policy. And this policy is, we are planning for workshops to align the policy with the new government priorities, as well as validation and submission to the cabinet. Next. We also have draft national policy for persons with disabilities, and it is currently at the review stage with our stakeholders, who are quite many. And then our next steps is the validation and public participation, and then forwarding the draft to Parliament for debate. Next. Then we have this is a new program, social risks and impact management policy. Here we are looking at the risks that the communities encounter when we have got infrastructure and development projects in our communities. And there is a presentation that we have just seen that is talking about gender-based violence, which really it's very, very key in this social risk and impact management policy. So then with that policy, the draft policy has been reviewed by a multi-sectorial committee, which comprises many ministries and many other players and partners. And then our next step with this policy, which is really key, is that we are sharing the draft with the senior government officials and the Parliamentary Committee on Social Protection for their validation. Next, we have National Older Persons and Aging Policy 2018, which is currently the policy is being implemented and is due for review. Next, we have the National Family Promotion and Protection Policy, and the policy has been submitted to Cabinet for consideration and approval, and the policy is currently awaiting that approval and also gazettement of the policy, printing and dissemination of it. Next. Now the priority areas after we have looked at this is that, as I've said, that we have this Community Group Registration Act of 2022. And this one now gives a legal direction in registration of groups, where majority of these groups are formed by women for socioeconomic empowerment. So that one is in place. But next is that we need sensitization to sensitize our social development officers, or rather our field officers and other stakeholders on the provision of the Act for compliance. So that is where we are in regard to that Community Group Registration Act. Then our next priority is the finalization of various development activities on bills and policies that are at different levels different levels, so that the directorate can achieve its objectives, as we have seen from the presentation that I've just done. And then again, we also have another priority area of rebranding the Directorate of Social Development based on the recommendations of the Strategic Outlook Position Paper of 2017, especially on continuous research to inform social development programs and building on emerging issues on social development and social protection and climate change interventions by the vulnerable groups in the community. And then we also have as our priority area, enhancement of collaborations and partnerships with relevant stakeholders for knowledge exchange and benchmarking on social development and social protection on good practices to inform planning and policy direction for improved service delivery to vulnerable populations. Next, yes. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm done. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ross. Ross from State Department of Social Protection on information that you have given us, quite informative on mandates of the Directorate, the programs that you have in place, the policies and legislative frameworks, and of course the priority areas, including even the very recent, the one everyone is talking about, climate change. I can see it is part of your initiatives. Really, thank you. And I want to encourage all of us. There is a lot on chat box. Let us keep looking through, and especially so in case you want to ask any question or make any comments, let's move into the chat box for progress on the same. Now we are going to move on to our next presenter, that is Dr. Ngatha Kabira, a senior lecturer, Faculty of Law, University of Nairobi. And this is an East Alonso Fellow from the Institute of Advanced Studies, South Africa. Ngatha is a research leader, the Women's Economic Empowerment Hub, the African Women's Studies of University of Nairobi, and of course our co-convener are the Gender and Political Economy, the International Research Collaborative Law and Societal Association USA. So karibu sana, Dr. Ngatha, that you can speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Sorry. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, but there's quite a lot from the echo.
Dr. It's like you have two gadgets on.
Yeah.
Could you?
You can unmute one.
Yeah.
You can mute one.
Yeah. In fact, disconnect audio from one of them.
All right, I'm sorry about that. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share our project on social protection for women's economic empowerment. The title of the project, please turn the slide. The title of the project, which I will share with you today, is on evaluating the impact of the government of Kenya's economic stimulus packages, a case study of Kazi Mtaani and Inua Jamii programs. This research project, it was conducted by the Women's Economic Empowerment Hub, which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and housed at the African Women's Studies Center at the University of Nairobi. The program has two main specific objectives. The first objective, I will let you know when to turn the slides. Thank you. The first objective of the project is to use the examples of Kazi Mtaani and Inua Jamii to evaluate the lessons that can be learned from the Kenya government's economic stimulus packages on social protection for future disaster preparedness for women's economic empowerment. The second objective is to document lessons that can be learned from women's experiences and knowledge on informal and societal measures that can be used to fill the gaps in the government of Kenya's COVID-19 economic stimulus packages. Please turn the slide. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic significantly affected men and women, particularly business owners and women in the informal sector. In response to this, what the government did was that they enacted numerous rules and regulations and policies, and in many ways, these measures contributed to the vulnerabilities of women workers in the informal sector. The measures resulted in business closures, in increased costs, and so on. So in response to this, what the government did was roll out some short-term and long-term economic stimulus packages in order to cushion the vulnerable members of the society. The government relied on several approaches. Some were monetary policies, others were fiscal policies, and another approach was to strengthen existing social protection programs. Monetary policies included the credit guarantee scheme, the 8-point economic stimulus package of May 31st, 2001, and the Kazi Mtaani program. The fiscal policies included reduction of taxes for businesses, and the strengthening of existing social protection programs included, for instance, what happened in the case of Inua Jamii. So let me say something about the two programs that we have studied so that we can all be on the same page. Please turn the slide. The first program that we studied is Kazi Mtaani. And as you may know, this is a national initiative that was launched in April 2020 to cushion the most vulnerable and able-bodied youth in informal settlements. They were supposed to be cushioned from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It started with a budget of about 10 billion and has employed over 283,210 youth in informal settlements across the 47 counties. We are now in the fourth cycle, so I'm sure the statistics will grow in terms of the number of youths that have benefited from this particular program. The program targets youth above 18 years to 35 years who are unemployed and has cushioned them by paying them about Kenya shillings 455 and their supervisors 505 Kenya shillings. And the payment is made via M-Pesa, which is the mobile money, for purposes of transparency and accountability. What Kenya National Bureau of Statistics reports is that the Kazi Mtaani and other social protection programs have increased the revenue performance of the country by about 26.8% in the 2020 financial year. Let me now speak about Inua Jamii. Inua Jamii is focused on the elderly. This is one of the government of Kenya's flagship national safety net program. It focuses on orphans and vulnerable children, the elderly persons and persons with severe disabilities. It also has a program within it, and I'm sure the social protection unit is in a much better position to speak about that, the Hungry Safety Net program. The cash transfers in the Inua Jamii program for 2020-2021 financial year accounted for about 1.62% of Kenya's national budget. Please turn the slide. So we set out to study these two particular programs, with Inua Jamii focusing on the elderly and the Kazi Mtaani program focusing on the youth and targeting specifically women who are beneficiaries of these particular groups. The approach we took a mixed methodological approach. It involved desk research and review of best practices. It also entailed the collection of qualitative and quantitative data from 4 counties, Nairobi, Kiambu, Kitui, and Nakuru. And we collected quantitative data from 994 participants who were interviewed in the 4 counties. We held focus group discussions, literature review was conducted. And at the end of the day, we prepared a report which was distilled, and 2 policy briefs were also produced. These particular policy briefs, as well as the report, are available on the University of Nairobi WeHub website, which I'll be able to share shortly. We are also hoping to be able to re-engage the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection, given the fact that obviously there's been a change in government, and there are quite a number of things that we have recommended in the report and in the 2 policy briefs, which we hope Madam Wagangi and their fellow colleagues will be able to take into account in this new phase of production of the new laws and the new policies. Please turn the slide. The key findings from this study that we conducted is that majority of the respondents did not receive any government support. Out of the 996 respondents, 78.4% had not received any government support. The qualitative research also corroborated this, as we found out that different kinds of formal, informal initiatives, such as religious, social protection models, civil society, women's circles, women's groups, and Nyumba Kumi, which is the local governance structures, were running outside of the formal government initiatives. So during COVID, women were actually relying more on these women's circles and these women's groups rather than from government support. And we are actually recommending that it's important to find the interface between the formal and the informal social protection schemes so as to maximize the kind of impact that social protection can have for women's economic empowerment. The second finding is that the majority of the respondents who received government funds were men as compared to women. 24.6% of the men received funds as opposed to 20.8% of the women. The third finding is that 97.5% of the respondents noted that the government's intervention through the two programs, Kazi Mtaani and Inua Jamii program, impacted the livelihoods of the targeted group. So in essence, those who were able to receive the funds did benefit from the particular funds that they received. Quantitative data revealed that 86.2% of the respondents were able to afford food because of this particular funds that they received. 54.9% used money for rent. And it's important to note that this is not a charity model in the sense that was described earlier, or a human rights-based model. For the Kazi Mtaani program, they were actually working in order to be able to receive the money that they were getting from the government. So 54.9% used the money for rent, 38.5% used it on clothing. So in comparison, there are those 14.2% spent the money on medical expenses. Of course, in the Inua Jamii program, which focuses on the elderly, the medical expenses were one of the most critical things that they were spending the social protection money on. So in Kazi Mtaani, for example, beneficiaries said that the program had empowered them to cater for their immediate needs, and 6.2% of the beneficiaries also saved the profits from the program to start small businesses. At the University of Nairobi, we have actually been able to incorporate 2 ladies who were part of the Kazi Mtaani program into our incubation project in order to enable them or empower them to grow their businesses. Please turn the slide. So broadly speaking, there are some key recommendations that we have shared in our policy briefs. The key recommendations speak to the design systems and specifically on recruitment, implementation, and the monitoring and evaluation processes. So we have spoken to the fact that the program needs to provide holistic sets of services, including trainings, productive asset transfers, in the case that consumption support, saving plans, and healthcare, particularly in the case of the older people. Payment system design. There is need for authentication via biometrics in order to have regular evidence. Expansion of the types and nature of work. The type of work should be expanded to ensure inclusivity of both men and women of different ages and abilities, and particularly in the case of pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, and mothers of young children. They cannot be expected to do the same type of work that the men are doing when they have their children there with them, especially for the hardcore manual labor. In terms of access to information, which was a major problem that was highlighted, it is important that there's advertisement through the media and to move beyond just advertisement of the opportunities through the chief's office. There is need to use multiple platforms, from the phone to radio, to WhatsApp, to the church, to the mosque, to chief barazas, so as to ensure that the programs are well, the information about the program is very well dispersed. So I have quite a number of other recommendations, but I know we are running out of time. So I'm just going to move towards the end of this presentation. Madam Wagangi spoke about the various policies that the ministry is working on. And we just want to also urge that as we move towards all these pieces of legislation that are being adopted, that we must revisit this 2014 social protection policy so that we can have an overarching social protection policy that mainstreams gender and takes into account the practical and strategic needs of men and women. And even in the development of all the legislative and policy and regulatory framework, it is important that as we move to this new phase or this next phase of social protection with the new government, the new structures, that all these laws and policies are gender responsive. The next point is on, so let's turn to the last slide, I think. The last slide. So I've spoken to engendering the legal, policy, and regulatory framework. No, the recommendations. Go back, please. So I've spoken to engendering the legal, policy, and regulatory framework. I now want to speak about civic education and consciousness raising on social protection for we. Access to information on government opportunities was lacking in all the counties that we visited. Not just in this program, but on the credit guarantee scheme, which is another social protection program, which another colleague is leading at the African Women's Studies Center, WeHub. So any information regarding social protection needs to be availed to the targeted groups so as to ensure that such packages benefit the intended groups, because our statistics show that 68.9%, only 68.9% of the 1,000 had received any information from the local authorities. Then training and mentorship. And we're really happy to see that the new government has set up some training opportunities in this fourth cycle of Kazi Mtaani. There's need for the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection to provide mentorship and training opportunities. And what I'm saying is what came out from the field, what the youth themselves were saying, what the elderly were saying, that it's important for them to be trained on financial and business management so as to be able to empower them to be self-sufficient. I liked that Dr. Amrik talked about this charity model. The youth and the youth were actually saying, we want to be self-sufficient. We want to be able to have our businesses. So can we be trained? Can we be mentored so that we can be able to provide for our families, given the necessary resources? Now, the last point is on ensuring that you build partnerships between the formal and the informal social protection schemes. So the informal ones are not even called social protection schemes, but when you look at what they're actually doing, they are indeed social protection schemes. They are women's circles, they are women's groups, they are religious groups that are finding ways to come together to ensure that their community is uplifted, that the women find ways to support each other. So women participated in social protection by forming initiatives that were independent from governmental institutions. They formed partnerships, they formed networks, and it's important to have all relevant stakeholders so as to be able to have all-inclusive social protection schemes that move beyond the individualistic, market-centered, neoliberal social protection models that have dominated our world for the past decade. So in conclusion, thank you so much. In conclusion, the government of Kenya's COVID-19 economic stimulus packages have supported women's work and women's economic empowerment through the two particular programs. However, lack of access to information and sustainability of the packages continues to be a major issue. So our project shows that it is very important for us to design social protection programs in such a manner that engenders women's economic empowerment and growth and takes into account the practical and strategic gender needs of both men and women. This will ensure that we are able to build and rebuild the economy with women in mind. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Dr. we appreciate, and of course, we want to appreciate the work that you have done on the two programs that you have analyzed, the Kazi Mtaani and Inua Jamii. Now we are going to go to Mr. John Ocheng, and I'll be asking Mr. Ocheng, kindly check your chat boxes for any messages that will be coming in, just to appreciate issues of time. And to all the members, after Mr. Ocheng, we are going to have just a question or two to the members who have spoken to us, and then we can proceed. Kindly, let's watch on time. Thank you. Mr. Ocheng, please. This is a policy manager innovations for poverty action, Kenya. And of course, he's a public policy and governance specialist with other special strength. And of course, a holder of a master's degree in project planning and management. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Dr. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Next slide. Yes, so IPA has sectoral expertise on several program areas, and that includes social protection, where we partner with governments and other implementing partners to work on working on households, moving households out of extreme poverty by creating economic opportunities for the poor. And IPA has a growing body of research on identifying and scaling effective protection programs, including cash transfers, graduation programs, and job training. But today, because Sarah gave us only 8 minutes, I will present just one study that was conducted in Kenya on cash transfers. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the study's title is The Effects of Universal Basic Income During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Kenya. And this study took advantage of a pre-existing large-scale evaluation of a UBI. This study was popularly known as UBI project here in Kenya. And it was examining to what extent cash transfers cushion poor families during hard times. The project measured how transfers, when issued during using different approaches, impact various aspects of the beneficiaries, like income, food security, mental well-being, and social interactions in the times of COVID. So as usual, for every research we conduct at IPA, we are often keen to ask ourselves how it plugs into the decision makers' needs, so that we have impact in the work we do. In this circumstance, we had a lot of debate on the merits of UBI, in this case, universal basic income, in developing and high income countries, but with less rigorous evidence. So anecdotally, UBI can cushion vulnerable families during hard times, but this evidence that is often difficult to put to test because it is neither here nor there. Interestingly, COVID occurred during the first year of the large-scale UBI that we were implementing, and so this presented an opportunity for us and the PIs to test this question alongside other critical social protection indicators. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we all know how COVID containment measures impacted the livelihoods of most vulnerable families across the planet, and the different mechanisms that different governments are putting in place to cushion their citizens. And so cash transfers, of course, dominated the interventions, which actually reached out to about 1.2 billion people worldwide. But as the pandemic persisted, governments faced difficulties in designing the cash transfer programs in a way that would achieve greater impact. So our study was conducted in 2 counties in Kenya, that is Siaya and Bomet counties, where collectively around 650,000 people lived below the poverty line. Next slide, please. Yes, so while IPA was the study partner, Give Directly implemented the interventions. Give Directly is an organization. And we sampled around 495 villages who were randomly assigned to some 4 groups. And 3 groups received different interventions. And one, of course, was the control group that received no intervention at all. So to give slightly more granular details on the 4 groups, the first group was the long-term UBI that cut across 44 villages. And each adult received around 0.5 USD per day for over 12 years. The second intervention was a short one, same amount of money targeting adults, but this was given for 2 years. And the third intervention was a lump sum one of 5,000 USD given as one-off payment to about 8,800 people. And then, of course, the last group received nothing, and the money was wired to the beneficiaries through M-Pesa, which is the mobile money transfer method here in Kenya. Next slide. Yeah, so overall, the study found that the transfer recipients experienced better food security and physical and mental health than those who had not received the cash transfers. Of course, along with some positive impacts on public health indicators. So small businesses that received recipients that had started prior to the pandemic remained operational, but income gains from these businesses were wiped out during that time. So on specific public health indicators like income, the long-term transfers in particular led to an increase in risk-taking commercial activities and also exposure to shocks. On hunger, beneficiaries were 5 to 11% less likely to report experiencing hunger, despite this hunger situation in those counties at that time. This was even better for the long-term recipients. In terms of illness, the recipients were 40% less likely to report sickness in the household. Mentally, that's on mental health, beneficiaries were less dispersed in both the short-term and long-term groups, though not in the lump sum group, the group that got the one-off payment. Overall, transfers continued to have the kinds of impacts on basic measures of well-being typically seen in pre-pandemic research. On health-seeking behavior and social interaction, there was little or no change in relation to public health. Of course, the interventions reduced the probability that recipients had sought medical attention at a hospital in the last 30 days by 3 to 5%, potentially freeing up the health systems. Next slide. Yeah, so this is the final slide. So in summary, and finally, for the policymakers in the room, cash transfers can help vulnerable families in households, but as in the case of the UBI study that we conducted, it may not be enough to completely cushion households from an economic tsunami of the nature of COVID-19. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cheng. And probably just before, I don't know whether Dr. Amrik has dropped off. We're going to do some 2 questions to both of them. I don't know whether she's still around. Dr. Amrik, are you still there?
No, she has dropped off.
It seems she has dropped off. So before we go to the next presenter, who is Kerabo Subi, I want to give just 2 opportunities to any question to the previous presenters. Any question to the previous presenters? Anyone who wants to come through? Of course, Dr. Amrik was talking about issues on, inclusive social protection, and she brought in the issue of COVID-19 and the Marsabit cases. We have had Romano, who was talking about the social assistance. I don't know if there's any member who has a question to Romano. We have Mwangi was giving us the programs. Anyone who would want to come through? Yes,
Dr. Stella's hand is up.
Yes, Dr. Stella, go ahead.
Thank you so much for the presenters. That was some amazing presentation. My name is Dr. Stella Bosire, the ED of the Africa Center for Health Systems and Gender Justice. I'd like to hear from the presenters their comment around really what I find to be an inversal relationship between social protection during COVID and the increased rates, but increased incidences of sexual and gender-based violence that occurred during COVID. Despite the fact that there were a lot of investments both from government and also from the non-state players, we saw lots of women, girls, and gender diverse persons really socially, economically, and culturally impacted negatively despite the stopgap mechanisms. I'm also surprised to hear that Marsabit had positive outcomes. What was the correlation of that when it comes to GBV? Shukran.
Yeah, thank you. I was hoping that Dr. Amrik would be there just to react also on the Marsabit and what we can benchmark with, just to make sure that other areas will not feel the same shock. So yeah, this is an open question to all of us, those of us who have been presenting. Mr. Ochen, you have any feedback? Kabira, you are there. And of course, Mwangangi, you're also there, and Romano. Anyone who would want to come through? Okay, Wansa, you can bring in your question as we look ahead to the first question. Let's pick the second question as well.
Apologies, mine's not a question. I'm a colleague to Amrik and I led the Marsabit work. So it's an attempt to respond to the question that has been raised on Marsabit. Yes, and I think what Amrik mentioned was that in comparison with the rest of the community, those who covered under that program fared much better. And it wasn't purely a social protection project. There was a lot of leveraging or layering of other sorts of support onto that. But the one thing that we did in that project, which minimized gender-based violence, was for start the targeting. We didn't go into the community and say we were doing this, but for the women. But we designed the project or program in such a way that that men self-screened themselves out of the project by using the group methodology, and that sort of checked all the boxes that go into most women's economic empowerment program. So we went out there, presented these. We reached out to the population that was receiving the cash transfers under the Hunger Safety Nets program, and so some men who were part of that, after attending a couple of sessions, decided this thing, the way it was designed, and after understanding what we are looking to do, decided, actually got asking if we could let their women attend on their behalf. So in as much as a few men remained, it ended up being a largely women program. I don't know whether I've responded to the question, but in summary, the how of programming or designing the programs can minimize some unintended consequences, such as gender-based violence.
Thank you very much. I was looking out to see whether there's any other hand that is lifted. Yeah, there's Dr. Kabir Nkata. Go, come through. Dr.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to say that, yes, thank you much. So what I wanted to say is that even though our work did not directly speak to the relationship between the social protection and gender-based violence, social protection for women's economic empowerment. Are you able to hear me, Dr. Wangila? Or I'm breaking?
We can hear you.
Okay, all right. So even though we did not focus on that particular question, what we found is that a model like Kazi Mtaani, where the women, the youth who are women are being empowered through through being given a work opportunity that in turn brings money into the household, not only empowered the individual women, but empowered the individual households. We also found that women were resilient in that by being given these particular opportunities, they were able to uplift their families from poverty, and they were able to feed their families, to pay rent, but there was no, what we found was with GBV, the question arose right after the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, and women and everyone was under lockdown. But most of these protection measures happened after the lifting of the lockdown. So I think it would be very, very interesting to see what that particular period, especially 2020, the connection between social protection and GBV. But for the purposes of our study, which focuses on the period after COVID, there really was no direct connection between those two particular questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. And there's a communication on the wall. We all put on our videos if you can for purposes of the photo. And we are moving on to the next presenter. Even as we do that, kindly put on your videos. We are moving on to Kirabo Suubi. And Kirabo is a gender economic specialist from International Center for Research on Women. She has focused on economic opportunity and security, health and reproductive rights, and social norms. Kasi Kirabo has a master's in science of science in public health from Sweden, and of course a PhD and master's in monitoring and evaluation. So I'll be welcoming Kirabo to come through. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Kindly note, just so that I could let you through, the rest of us who are coming through, we have 6 minutes to do our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will endeavor to adhere to the time allocated. So I'm going to present share findings briefly on our Rebuild project. So Rebuild project is implemented by International Center for Research on Women. It's a multi-country study in Kenya, Uganda, and India. Under this project, we undertook a policy research informed by the contextual analysis of the gendered impacts of the COVID-19 crisis on female workers in the urban informal economies. And this included the deepening on the gender inequalities, the economic vulnerabilities, the risks to GBV, and the restricted access to SRH services. So the specific objectives for our study, we looked at, we intended to map and analyze the scope and the nature of policies, strategies, implementation challenges, and the mitigation methods used by the various actors during the pandemic. We also aim to generate evidence on the ways in which the pre-existing inequalities and the vulnerabilities experienced by the women working in the informal economies were exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. We went ahead to analyze the state and the local mechanisms and the mitigation measures implemented in response to the pandemic. And we've also carried out research evidence synthesis, including best practices, and how to turn those into an actionable agenda through periodic disseminations, such as these and other high-level meetings and policy advocacy initiatives with several stakeholders. Because of the internet connectivity, allow me to switch off my video a bit to allow bandwidth so I can be able to complete the presentation successfully. So we know that, sorry about that. So we know that in Kenya, we found out that in Kenya, 83% of the labor force is informally employed, and women account for 86% of this population. In Uganda, 75% of the labor force is informally employed, and 87% of this population in the informal economy are women. In Kenya, 60.7% unlicensed businesses, establishments are solely female-owned, and thus this shows the economic vulnerability, especially at the height of the pandemic, with the government policies and measurements that were put in place. In Uganda, the informal economy contributes to over 50% to the country's GDP. So this shows the importance of the informal sector. In Kenya, the government has committed 0.4% of its GDP towards social protection. This amounts to about 26 billion Kenyan shillings. We see that in Uganda currently, the government spends only 0.7% of its GDP on social protection. For both governments in Kenya and Uganda, they are what they have allocated towards social protection is a percentage that is lower according to the sub-Saharan average of 2.1%. Both governments of Kenya and Uganda, the COVID-19 responses in terms of physical, monetary, and social response policies did not benefit the informal economy workers, as we've seen also from the previous presenters. But we know that as a result of the pandemic and the implemented policies, there were a lot of job losses, a lot of wage cuts, business closures. For example, in Uganda, there was 75% of the micro and small businesses laid off employees. We have also seen that due to these policy measures, it increased women workers' exposure to the risk of GBV because there was curfew and then movement restrictions, and some of these women had to move to walk long distances to and from work. So this exposed them to the risk of GBV. Before I dig into the findings on our study, for our study, the methodology, we did desk review, we did expert consultations, case studies were done with several informal women worker leaders. And then for the primary research, this was conducted in Nairobi to focus on women in the informal sector in the urban economies, and also in Kampala for Uganda. So the findings that I'm going to share are basically focused on Kenya and Uganda. We know that Uganda has a social protection policy of 2019, and the Kenya's constitution too, Article 43, sub-Article 1E, provides that everyone has a right to social security, and it obligates the government to provide social protection to the vulnerable groups. Given the weak social protection mechanisms in the low-income countries such as Uganda and Kenya, those with low and socioeconomic status such as the informal workers were particularly vulnerable to the COVID-19 related policies. I've already mentioned some of them, the curfews, the movement restrictions, and the others, and we know what resulted from those. So social protection mechanisms for women in the informal sector and the general population currently remain weak in both countries. Over 90% of the informal women workers that we spoke to in both Uganda.
Just an interruption a bit, Kirabo, kindly finalize.
sorry about that. So over 90% of the informal women workers in Kenya and Uganda indicated that the pandemic had affected their financial well-being, and many of them resorted to reducing food expenditures, non-food expenditures, spending on their savings, cutting out other critical costs. In Kenya, we saw that over 80% of the informal women workers that we spoke to had knowledge of the government social protection relief measures, but many of them did not receive this. And in Uganda, 90% of the women that we spoke to, informal women workers that we spoke to, had knowledge of the government social protection relief measures, such as the food rations, the cash transfers, but many of them did not receive these. When we look at the graph, as I wind up, when we look at the graph, we see that the blue represents Uganda. Is that blue or purple? Represents Uganda, and then the orange is for Kenya. That when you focus on the graph for food rations, 63% of the informal women workers indicated that they received the food rations, whereas in Kenya, only 10% of them indicated that they received the food rations. When you focus on the cash transfers, only 9% of the informal women workers in Uganda benefited from the cash transfers, and then only 12% in Kenya received the cash transfers.
Okay.
Next slide. As we wrap up, we've also seen from Dr. Kathari's presentation that many of those people that received the relief, especially the cash transfers, it was allocated to the basic needs like food purchases. For us, we had 91% of the respondents saying that they purchased food. Others allocated it to shelter and health expenses and the like. So going briefly to the recommendations or lessons learned and what would be implemented for policy and practice. Responsive social protection mechanisms are vital to enable low-income groups to recover from social and economic shocks. And there is research is still cut out for us as researchers and practitioners to focus on what would be the most suitable design features of a responsive and comprehensive social protection mechanism that would fit, that would be a good fit for women in the informal sector. Also anchoring shock responsive social mechanisms in the policy for assured financial commitments, allocations, and timely disbursements, such as legal provisions, will cushion the beneficiaries from escalating inflationary rates, which affects the value of the disbursed amounts. We urge the governments to increase the percentages of GDP allocated towards social protection. And also just for us to understand that there is still need to undertake a deep dive into social vulnerability of different groups to determine the most corresponding and appropriate social protection support. So due to time, I will.
Thank you very much, Madam Kirabo. Yeah, it's about time. I think you have also taken a little more. We are supposed to be taking up on breakout sessions, and even as we plan to go ahead with that, I would just want to bring Wairimu, if she's there, just in about 5 minutes. Wairimu, kindly take 5 minutes, and in the next 5 minutes, we should be taking our breakout sessions. Wairimu, kindly.
Thank you.
Please make it 5 minutes.
Okay. Can you run the slide from that end?
Yes, slide coming up. Where is it?
Thank you. Okay, so 5 minutes. So this is a summary of a study that we are yet to conclude, falling through the cracks, an intersectional assessment of the economic exclusion of women involved in business and informal settlements of Nairobi County, Kenya. And we looked at informal settlements, including Mukuru kwa Jenga, Kibera, Korogosho, and Mathare. And the reason for this was because of the work that we did during the COVID-19 period, where we did some cash transfers in those informal settlements, specifically targeting households that had women and girls with intellectual challenges. And we wanted to understand further what other identities cause groups to fall through the cracks when it comes to economic empowerment and social protection. And so we did this in partnership with Making It Work, a project of humanity and inclusion. And this was also informed by our need as an organization to understand intersectionality. Next slide. And basically, intersectionality is about identifying how multiple identities play out when it comes to creating patterns of oppression or exclusion from accessing opportunities. And it is important that as we think about intersectionality in development processes, that organizations look within themselves to really understand whether they truly understand intersectionality and are taking care of the likely biases that could result if they don't take care of this particular aspect. Next. In terms of the context and approach, I've already said it was a 6-month cooperation, and we focused on informal settlements here in Nairobi County. It was, it was very simple in the way we conducted it. We looked into issues of, we conducted key informant interviews, and we also conducted focus group discussions with particular women, but we also targeted organizations that were based in Nairobi, but also outside of Nairobi, including Kisumu for this particular study. Next. Okay, and then we had also earlier on, a few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, conducted a study, Safely Engaged, that looked to address issues of gender-based violence and economic exclusion for girls and young women in Kenya. And this was particularly targeted at girls and women that were out of school, based on the work that we did in Kwale County around trafficking and exclusion of this particular group of women from economic practices. Now, key findings, because of time, I will probably say that in terms of the informal sector, we know that most of the people involved are women, and it's also the kind of relationships that come up that also compromise the ability of women to stabilize and to grow in business, including the labor relationships, and also how they engage contractually with the governments that are responsible, for example, and also with institutions, financial institutions, etc., for credit. We also established that most of the women or individuals who do businesses are between the age of 18 to 34, and that highlighted a potential, the potential risk in terms of ageism, which might be playing a negative role in terms of access to economic opportunities and has not been paid attention to. Okay, next. We found that in terms of poverty and marginalization, this become complex when gender, age, and disability intersect. And this was based on our desk review from the Leave No Woman Behind report of 2020. We came across issues of high literacy, lack of self-esteem, and also we identified that women and girls with disabilities living in slums often miss out on targeted health promotions and services, which has an impact on how they engage in terms of economic opportunities. They have difficulties in moving around. They have difficulties interacting and networking. They have difficulties with sanitation facilities because of lack of accessibility, and that affects how and where they do business. In terms of the political violence and how that affected women's ability to do business, we know from a study by Amnesty way back in 2020 that violence within informal settlements was also due to gender and ethnicity, conducted by unemployed youth and men who normally target women mostly. But we also know that because of this, for example, recently, that was in 2020, as recent as 2022, we found that refugee women in the informal settlements who are conducting business were asked to close their businesses because they were likely to be targets. Okay. The operating environment I have already talked about, accessibility, etc. We established that they tend to avoid unsafe public spaces and situations where energy and time will be used to counter violence and defend themselves. And this also means that they limit their opportunities for business. We also established, okay, all right. In terms, do you want to go back to the other slide, please? Thank you. We also established that most of the flourishing small and medium-sized businesses were owned by men, while the less successful ones were owned by women. And this also is because of the kind of support system that is available in the ecosystem. We continue. In terms,
Wahome, kindly time. Wrap up.
Okay, so we're also able to look at issues of disabilities and how the women with disabilities reported sexual harassment when looking to secure business permits or business licenses from corrupt government officials. Next. And then in terms of citizenship, I've already talked about the issue of refugee women who conduct business and what they were advised to do in 2022 to hide and close their businesses, an issue that is often overlooked. Ethnicity in terms of accessing funds that are intended to empower women was also another issue. So being a woman is not enough. Being a woman with disabilities is not enough. There is also the ethnicity factor that plays out in terms of how decisions are made. Marital status, especially for single women, again, discriminated against, but also very affected because of the issue of caregiving for their children. And also because most of them cannot afford to hire care so that they can go about their business as well. 2 recommendations. 1, for policymakers, recognize that frameworks did not necessarily delve deep into intersectionality. And so that's a gap that we need to look into. Stop pigeonholing of diversities in our program designs and relook how we design and also implement our programs, and also be intentional in understanding intersectionality and applying the same right from conceptualization to design phase. Thank you.
Dr. you are muted.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Wairimu. I was saying that we bring in Elizabeth. Elizabeth, kindly 5 minutes for your presentation, followed by the next presenter. And Elizabeth, that is a team lead from UN's Women's Economic Empowerment Unit, having done quite a lot across nations. So Elizabeth, kindly take 5 minutes. I'll be stopping you.
Thank you, Dr. Wangila. I'm Tabitha Kimanzi. I'll be doing the presentation on behalf of Elizabeth Obanda, the team lead Women Economic Empowerment Unit, UN Women Kenya Country Office. So I'll go straight to the study that we did recently. I want to acknowledge the support that we got from the UN WeHub in partnership with Dr. Mary Mbivi and Professor Kabira for providing a lot of guidance when we were doing the study, and also the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics for validating the findings. So what the program was being done in several countries, Kenya among them, and the purpose was to assess how the stimulus packages that the government had rolled out due to COVID-19, how engendered they were. So next slide, please. So we all know the impacts of COVID-19 globally. Even the global GDP dropped, and in Kenya, what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is that it exposed the inequalities between women and men, and we acknowledge that women are 50.5 approximately of the total population in the country, and the lockdown measures that were put in place resulted in increasing the burden of unpaid care work and domestic work, and also the issues of gender-based violence exacerbated due to the lockdown and the COVID-19 issues. So what happened is that in the financial year of 2020-2021, the government injected 53.7 billion into the economy, and the purpose of this was to cushion the key sectors and cushion the vulnerable households. So it was a social protection injection into our economy. And as a result, since last year, we were able to do a study in several countries, Kenya included, and the purpose was to assess what I have just said, the gender responsiveness of the fiscal and economic stimulus packages that were adopted in response to COVID-19. And after that, we went ahead and launched and implemented an advocacy campaign through partnerships with state actors and non-state actors. So what the study focused, the study looked at several several fiscal stimulus packages, including the cash transfer to vulnerable families, that is a Inua Jamii. It has been spoken about in this meeting, the Kazi Mtaani, support to the SMEs, the education sector, SMEs on liquidity, the health sector, the agricultural sector, tourism, environment, and the manufacturing sector. Next slide, please. So the findings of this study, what we found out was that the women in our country are more deprived than men in social economic participation, in terms of leadership, in nutrition, and the issue of unpaid care and domestic work was more burdening to women during the pandemic. Unfortunately, the cash transfer program did not expand their scope. The number of beneficiaries did not expand during COVID-19 as we would have expected, but they rather continued with existing beneficiaries. Unfortunately, the amounts that were disbursed in 2020-2021 were less compared to 2019-2020. The other finding was that most of the job creation packages that were targeted by the stimulus package were focused on public works where women are less represented. So the issue again on gender equality, on the issue of equal access to opportunities did not take place during in these interventions. The only provision, the only the only fiscal package that provided a specific and what would I call it? But a specific package for women, youth, and PWDs with the credit guarantee scheme, but it did not explicitly take specific concerns, especially for the target women. So the amount is there, it is stated, but it is the other issue that comes up even with AGPO. We all know about AGPO, although the government gives out the regulations 30%, all this is, up to what extent does the government implement this? The other issue was also that the data that was being provided by all these departments working in these stimulus packages programs did not provide disaggregated data. So the only disaggregated data that was available to us was the cash transfer data. We were able to know how many number of women, how many men, how many youth, but other economic stimulus packages did not provide that. The other thing is that as a result of this, what happened is that we were able to develop a policy brief, an advocacy tool, and an advocacy strategy. And we have given recommendations to both the government and non-state actors on how to engender fiscal stimulus and economic packages moving forward. Next slide, please.
Kindly wrap up.
Thank you. So the lessons we learned and what we are recommending that are taken into consideration in policy is the issue of providing disaggregated data. We are lobbying the government to increase coverage, both budgetary on the Inua Jamii, the Kazi Mtaani, and we're also making special requests that registrations for persons with severe disabilities is more accessible, and they eliminate the registration fee because that has been limiting their access. The other thing is that we were lobbying the government to target female-headed households as a category of vulnerability in cash transfer support. Currently, it is not a category, and we all know what that impact has. The other thing is also the issue of enforcing the requirements for AGPO, and the overall, our main recommendation was moving forward, the economic stimulus packages need to be more gender responsive. They need to include the needs for women, men, girls, and boys for better outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is just a photo of our partners when we were doing the consultative forum on this study with women movements at Hilton. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay.
So lastly, we are going to have a presentation from Rispa Chebet, the Program Officer, Christian Aid Kenya. Madam Rispa, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there, Daktari. Thank you.
Yeah, kindly take the floor.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to present. Mine is not a study that was done, but a project that we implemented in one of the counties, that is in Makueni County. And because of time limitations, Christian Aid was able to do a project on health and nutrition. And specifically, it had two aspects. It had a nutrition aspect and it had the other bit of universal health coverage. And for this presentation, because of time, I will focus on the universal health coverage thing that we did. So we understand that 17% of Kenyans, which is a whole 8.9 million people, are poor, which is, you know, if issues and if it's not properly mitigated and we get to the 25%, then it will mean that a quarter of our population are poor, which is not a very good indicator. Looking at the rate of stunting of children, it stands at 26%. The reason I have this in relation to social protection is because stunting really affects the overall growth and development of a child. And you know, it is like a circle that later on comes to eat us up. When it comes to NHIF coverage, because our project was focusing specifically on the NHIF, it is covering only 7 million people, which is only 24% of Kenyans. So leaving behind a whole 76% of the population, almost 3/4 of the population, and which means we are still far. So the main objective of this project, we wanted to contribute to responsive, accountable, and accessible health and nutrition services in Makueni County. Next slide, please. So what did we target? We were targeting 250 households. I know this one is a drop in the ocean considering the population of Makueni, but we were taking it as a, you know, a pilot project so that we are able to upscale in the near future. And so when it comes to sensitization, we were targeting to sensitize 2,250 people on universal health coverage cover. And so remember, Makueni County was a county that implemented Makueni Care. It is a big champion on that. But then there's a lot of, you know, toss up and about because of, you know, the transitioning in the counties and all that. And so there is need for the counties to sensitize people, and specifically Makueni, to now transition to the NHIF, which has more benefits and has a wider coverage, because Makueni Care is people are able to access care only in Makueni. And so the approach, we used the Village Savings and Loans Associations. So therefore, from this project, 120 vulnerable households were directly supported by the projects. And if you break down the 120 households, we had 6 households with the people enabled differently, or we can call it people living with disabilities. We had 40 people living with HIV, 60 households with elderly caregivers, and 14 vulnerable young mothers households. Next slide, please. Findings and the key findings. The project was running for 7 months. It is coming to an end in the 30th of April, so it's still an ongoing project. But of course, we can have very key findings for the results. The community was sensitized on the need for universal healthcare services. Why? Because you realize, much as we may think people know a lot about NHIF cover, we realize that there's a lot of, you know, need to now even go down to the community and give people the information, because they have very different information from the reality. Another thing was the improved health-seeking behavior of the people, especially by the poor. When you are poor and you know you are sick, you are not able to like have an option, but just to, you know, use other available option, even, you know, like herbal medicine. But now, because of this project, we realized there was an increased access and uptake to health services by the poor and excluded. Why? Number one, because they felt empowered because of the knowledge. Number two, because of the NHIF coverage that they were able to be given by the project. And as I said earlier, yes, it was covering a very small population, but yes, it was just, you know, a pilot so that you can upscale the project to feature up in Makueni County as a social insurance. Daktari?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now, sorry, members, that we have had to move. Right now, I want to call upon Blantina. Madam Blantina, are you there? From, are you there? From CRUA?
Blantina from
Yes.
Oxfam.
Yeah, Blantina, okay, just proceed.
Daktari, maybe before she comes, You can follow our Christian Aid social media handles. We still have a lot of information that maybe were pending. Thank you very much. Back to you, Dr.
Yeah, thank you. Madam Blandina from Oxfam, kindly take the lead.
Thank you. So the plan was to go into breakout sessions, but we also take note of the fact that we have completely run out of time. So what we have decided is to have a plenary discussions on the two questions that we were going to go into groups and discuss. And I will post the questions in the chat so that I don't have to keep repeating them. Just give me a minute.
The questions have been posted. I can see Madam Sarah has put them on the chat box, Madam Blantina.
Okay, great. And the first one was basically, we've had the presentations from the different presenters who have shared what they are doing as far as social protection is concerned. And the first question was, what do we see as the design features of a shock responsive, inclusive and comprehensive social protection that the government of Kenya and other key stakeholders can adopt? And then the second question was, as researchers and practitioners, how do we build a robust investment case for social protection? So please feel free to raise your hand. We'll just call upon you to give your response. But also, because of time, would really appreciate if we can have some responses on the chat box, and we'll try to read them as they come in. So first thoughts, anyone? I know the questions are in the chat box.
Madam Bobson, you are muted. Kindly unmute.
Sorry about that. No, I was just saying, as I wait for people to raise their hands, that we should take into consideration some of the things that have been highlighted in some of the presentations. You know, I noted aspects of being highlighted that financial inclusion alone cannot guarantee social protection. We need to really change the model of how we do this in our different areas of work. So any first takers? And I was facilitating this session with Moses. Moses, please feel free to come in.
Okay, I hope you can hear me, right? Okay, thank you so much. To make us understand the first question, basically, we are trying to get to understand features that would cater for the needs of different population groups or individuals, respond to various shocks, and ensure adequate and sustainable funding. So just like in implementation of certain women's economic empowerment interventions or programs, what are these features that we feel, if integrated, would help us achieve the end results or outcomes that we aspire to see? Can somebody help us here?
I see Dr. Stella Zanda. Go ahead.
Shukran. So my thoughts, for example, particularly on the first question would be, I think we are very, very reactionary, you know. If you're going to be able to implement a robust social protection intervention, then we cannot be reactionary. What we saw in COVID, what we see sometimes in conflict, what we see in any crisis, even the climate crisis that we're experiencing. So that has to be. Number two is that there has to be accuracy in the data of vulnerable populations that we're serving. So for example, how many women within within Makueni, for instance, to the last presenter? How many women within Makueni? How many elder people? How many people with disability? Because if you're going to scale up, then it helps you. It helps you understand that the investment that is going to be made in the scaling up of the programs how they are going to look like. The other one is around inclusivity. Lots of the time we are such an ableistic society, you know. We don't consider, we're such an ageism society. If you think about it, a lot of our interventions are to able-bodied people, and yet those who face the most shocks were either people living with disability, gender diverse persons, young women, particularly young girls who are already mothers, and also women who came from low socioeconomic status. So we must be able to constantly remind ourselves, because it's usually a bias that we have around inclusivity. And then our programs have to be very comprehensive. When we talk about health, can we think about, for instance, and I'm being very biased here as a practitioner of health, is that we have to just not think about health outcomes, but think about what are the social determinants of health, and also bring those social determinants of health. You're thinking about poverty, you're thinking about cultural factors, and bring them to be able to now expound the intervention that actually now thinks about where the problems would be. Just a few sentences on the last question around what does it look like to build robust investments. Number one, we have to have, again, data on cost-effective benefits analysis and demonstration of what does it look like to have economic impact, you know, on social protection programs towards poverty reduction, towards better health outcome, you know, human capital development, and on all this, which feeds into a macro development of the economy. Then the policymakers have to be there. I mean, if you think about Kenya, we had a number of them, but if you think about how they did not really target the right populations, it's because the manner in which they have. When you look at our constitution, it's very clear around the segregation of the government, the national government and the county government. So if you're thinking about these interventions, you have to think about when a policy sits at national, has that policy been actually domesticated at the county level such that it actually now brings interventions within the county level? Shukran.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stella. We're going to give this chance to somebody else to try to help us again with their thoughts on this topic.
As we wait for another person to come in, I see responses from Dr. Kabira, where she says the payment system design authentication needs to be done via biometrics for regular evidence. The design also needs to be multi-sectoral, and I think this is something that Dr. Bosiria has also highlighted. The selection criteria needs to be transparent. The design should also take into account, you know, the practical and strategic needs of the people we are targeting. And then lastly, in the selection criteria, we also need to take into account the intersectional vulnerabilities in the different households that we are targeting. Back to you, Okello.
Thank you so much, Blandina, for taking us through that. Just in addition to what has been discussed in that first question, something we really need to also put into consideration would be sustainability of these programs so that they are able to respond and completely protect and prevent issues or concerns that different target groups are going through. Number two, I would also add that we really need to adopt aspect of technology so that if it's transfer of finances, it's done properly and in an efficient manner to the right individuals. Then having looked at that, perhaps we can look at the second question. Second question, let me read it here. That as researchers and practitioners, how do we build a robust investment case for social protection? So this is the question that the next question we have. Somebody that is willing to take us through this. Maybe to elaborate further, this entails building a robust investment case. and it involves demonstrating economic and social benefits that social protection programs can bring, as well as their long-term sustainability. So we want to look at what are some of these opportunities that exist. Anybody that is willing to take up this question?
Just as we wait, there's also feedback coming in from Simanto Colette, who says that designing a shock responsive system needs to take a participatory approach and also to harness on digital platforms. Back to the second question.
Let us, we have like 5 minutes left on these questions. Somebody within us that is having solution to this, or would want to share something that they have experienced during the period that they have been in programs, kindly. Well, I'll provide an hint.
Okay.
Yeah, John, kindly proceed.
Yes, allow me to give quick, brief responses. So to start with the second question, I hope I understood it clearly. For me to demonstrate why we need investment in this is basically to show why it matters. Why should we care, and why should all stakeholders, including policy makers, care to invest in this sector? And for me, COVID just left us the other day, and we have a lot of data and evidence of how it like destroyed families and economies, and I think we can use that data is packaged so well in a way that it can be like taken up and consumed by policymakers and other investors in the sector. That would be super good. Then back to the other question. For me, I look at social protection, the programming and the interventions around social protection in two ways. One, there are those that are meant to like make populations prepared for any shocks that may come their way. And I think, and then the other one is like a response, an emergency response when shocks have come and there are people who are suffering and we need to respond. In either case, I think we need to look at the different facets of the problem, both politically, economically, socially, and culturally, so that you don't intervene economically to a problem that requires like psychosocial support. There are people who already are economically stable, but shocks come and disrupt some of the different aspects of life. So we need to examine using data, existing data, and probably taking time to study the problem and the challenges. We need to invest time and understand what we are responding to. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. Just in addition to what has been said, I would also submit my thoughts on this matter. One is that we would want to, with evidence, provide or demonstrate the kind of problem that various individuals are exposed to due to effects that can be solved by social protection interventions. Number two, I would also say that there is need to demonstrate the importance of responding and how it would help various target individuals to socioeconomically participate in the general growth of the economy, as also something that we really need to put into consideration. Then, yeah, those are my two thoughts on this. So we'll give, I'll hand it over to Blandina if you've got something to say, or any other group member before we close this.
I see Dr. Nkatha's hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I think it just struck me that one of the most amazing things that happened today is we got to see all these people, all these different practitioners and researchers who are working on all these areas in social protection. And really the answer to how we build a robust investment case is to consolidate all these findings and all this amazing research and bring this knowledge base together, distill the key ideas so that you can build an evidence-based investment case for social protection. And I'm sure the research that has been put together, not just by the participants in this particular group, there's a lot more happening in the field. So I think bringing and continuing to build this kind of conversation so that we know who is working on what and who has found out what, and then distilling all these ideas and presenting a case, making a case that social protection is very important, and we need money. We need the money to be able, or we need financing in order to be able to ensure that these programs are sustainable, that we can design programs that actually bring about economic empowerment at the end of the day. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see we are out of time. Basically, just some things that I've just noted is on the need to coordinate all the stakeholders working on, the social protection sector, the need to collect evidence and learn from each other on what is working and not working so that we don't reinvent the wheel. They need to take a holistic approach or multi-sectoral approach in addressing this. Also contextual issues and the need to just leverage on the emerging issues like leveraging on digital platforms, but more importantly also putting the communities at the center of this and having a participatory approach to this. And I see Simanto also saying we also need to consider the political and institutional context, e.g. the legal and regulatory environment, the capacity of the government, agencies, and the potential for stakeholders, support or opposition. Thank you, Simanto. Back to you, Dr. Arim.
Thank you very much, Blantina from Oxfam and John from CRU. We appreciate what you have done. We are sorry that we did not really have enough time and that some of us were not given ample time to illustrate the extent of their work. And we hope that next time this shall be done in a better way. We will improve on that. And lastly, I would wish to appreciate all the members who have been present for this particular forum. It has been a very enlightening moment. I hope that we can pick up the learning points and push to the next level. So really allow me to specifically mention 3 or so presenters. That was Madam Rispa Chebet from Christian Aid Kenya, Ms. Elizabeth Obanda from UN Women, and of course we also had Wairimo from COVAL, who really, I know you must have had quite a lot for us, but unfortunately because of time, it was not possible that we give you all the ample time for your presentation. However, we appreciate every other presenter. I wish to call upon Crispin or Sarah in case you have anything to mention before we can call the meeting to an
end. Thank you so much for leading us this far. And from us, the update that we have, I think in the interest of time, we will share it via email. I also want to appreciate each and every one of you who've managed to log in and stay through the end. It's always not easy to have people for 2 hours virtual meetings. We will compile a report of this and of course the key areas and what we've learned out of all the presentations that you've made. We will also make reference to the materials that you've shared, and then of course share what we call a learning brief, which will also guide the next agenda, and even as we seek to work with other development partners and of course the government and other stakeholders. To you, Dr. Fanis, we are glad that you led this far, and all of us who have made a presentation. Rosu Mwangangi, on behalf of the team that is here, please pass our regards to the State Department for Social Development, and thanks for giving us the government representation on this forum. Back to you, Fanis.
Great, it has been a good moment exchanging knowledge, dissemination as well, and we appreciate every findings and every research recommendations that have come across. I want to appreciate ICRW for making this very informative workshop that has given us an insight of social protection and what is going on. Thank you very much for giving me a moment to be your moderator. Until then, thank you. Let us meet again. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.